Montana, late November 1978. If you drove past the Kellerman property that autumn, you might have noticed something strange. Through the open barn doors, there was metal. Curved, corrugated metal, gleaming dully in the fading light. A building inside a building. Locals slowed down. Some laughed. Others shook their heads and kept driving. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know yet, was that they were looking at the difference between survival and catastrophe. By the time you finish this story, you'll understand why this crazy idea became the blueprint for surviving extreme cold in the Northern Rockies. But first, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week I bring you one real frontier technique that actually saved lives when it mattered most. And to drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know if you've ever faced a winter that tested everything you thought you knew. Because Sarah Kellerman was about to face exactly that. The question wasn't whether the blizzard would come. It was whether she'd still be alive when it left. Sarah Kellerman wasn't an engineer. She was a 34-year-old widow trying to hold together a 240-acre cattle ranch with 2 young daughters and a mortgage that didn't care about grief. Her husband, Daniel, had died in a logging accident that spring. The life insurance barely covered the funeral. Now it was November. The first hard frost had already hit, and Sarah had a problem that was going to kill her if she didn't solve it. The main cabin, the one Daniel had built when they were newlyweds, had a cracked foundation. The northeast wall leaned inward. The stone chimney had separated from the structure, leaving a 2-inch gap that screamed wind straight into the living room. Fixing it properly would cost $4,000. She had $340 in the bank. The barn, on the other hand, was solid. Daniel's father had built it in the 1940s. Post and beam construction, 40 feet long, 28 feet wide, with a gambrel roof that had weathered 4 decades of Montana winters without complaint. But it was a barn. Massive. Impossible to heat. The wind sliced through gaps in the siding like the walls weren't even there. Sarah's girls were already getting sick. The oldest, Emma, had started coughing at night. That deep, wet cough that meant bronchitis was coming. So Sarah made a decision that would have sounded insane to anyone who hadn't run out of options. She drove to the Army surplus yard in Billings and bought a Quonset hut for $220. It was Korean War surplus. Corrugated steel. 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, 8 feet tall at the peak. The kind of temporary shelter the military used for supply storage. The surplus dealer thought she was buying it for equipment storage. Good price, he said. Keeps the rain off. Sarah nodded. She didn't tell him she was going to live in it. The idea had come to her while she was standing in the barn one cold afternoon, watching her breath fog in the air. The barn itself was too big to heat. But what if she didn't try to heat the barn? What if she built something small inside it? Something she could actually keep warm, and let the barn be the outer shell. 2 walls instead of 1. A buffer of dead air in between. The barn would block the wind. The Quonset would hold the heat. It wasn't genius. It was desperation with a blueprint. She spent the next 2 weeks assembling the Quonset hut in the center of the barn. The corrugated panels bolted together in interlocking arcs. She positioned it 8 feet from the barn's north wall, the side that caught the worst wind, and 6 feet from the south. Inside the Quonset, she installed a small cast-iron stove. Nothing fancy. A Vogelzang Deluxe from the hardware store, rated for 1,200 square feet, but she was only heating 240. The stovepipe ran straight up through the curved roof of the Quonset, then continued another 12 feet through the barn's gambrel peak. 2 roofs, 2 barriers against downdrafts. Around the Quonset, in the space between the metal shell and the barn walls, she stacked firewood. Cords of it, close enough to dry from residual heat, far enough to stay safe. She moved 2 cots, a table, and a kerosene lamp inside. Hung wool blankets as interior dividers. Laid down a canvas tarp over the dirt floor. It looked exactly like what it was. A desperate woman building a survival capsule inside a barn because she couldn't afford anything better. And when her nearest neighbor, a man named Carl Hoskins, stopped by to see what she was doing, he stood in the barn doorway for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Sarah, that's a tin can inside a wooden box. You're going to freeze to death in there." She looked at him. Maybe, she said, but I'll freeze slower than I would in the cabin. Hoskins shook his head and left. By December, half the valley had heard about it. The widow Kellerman building a shelter inside shelter, using army surplus junk. Too proud, or too foolish, to ask for help. They didn't say it to her face, but they said it. Let me show you what Sarah Kellerman actually built. Because on the surface, it looked like madness. But the physics? The physics were flawless. The Quonset hut itself was 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, and 8 feet high at the center arch corrugated galvanized steel, 22-gauge thickness. The curve of the arch meant no flat surfaces for snow to accumulate, no corners for wind to grab. But the real innovation wasn't the Quonset. It was the gap. 8 feet of open air between the Quonset's north side and the barn's north wall. 6 feet to the south. 4 feet to the east and west. That air gap wasn't wasted space. It was insulation. Still air is one of the best thermal barriers in nature, better than most manufactured materials. Our value of roughly 1.0 per inch of dead air space. Multiply that by 72 inches, and you're looking at an effective R70 barrier on the windward side. For context, modern Montana building code requires R21 in walls. The barn itself blocked wind penetration. The Quonset's curved steel shell had minimal surface area exposed to convective heat loss. And because the barn was unheated, there was no temperature differential to drive condensation on the Quonset's exterior. Inside the Quonset, the cast iron stove sat in the southwest corner, the leeward side, away from the prevailing wind. The stovepipe ran vertically through both roofs without bends, creating natural draft. The firewood storage in the outer gap wasn't just convenient. It was strategic. As the stove radiated heat, the Quonset's steel shell warmed. That warmth bled into the surrounding air gap, gently drying the firewood. Moisture content dropped from 22% to under 15% within 2 weeks of stacking. Drywood burns hotter and cleaner. Hotter fires mean better combustion efficiency. Better efficiency means less wood consumption per BTU of heat. And because the barn itself was a windbreak, Sarah could open the barn doors during the day to load firewood without losing interior heat from the Quonset. The thermal mass of the steel shell held temperature steady. From a structural standpoint, it was simple. From a thermodynamic standpoint, it was brilliant. But to the people who saw it, it just looked wrong. Carl Hoskins wasn't the only one who thought she'd made a mistake. Ed Pruitt, a Finnish carpenter with 30 years of experience building houses from Great Falls to Bozeman, stopped by in early December. He stood in the barn, looking at the curved metal shell, the stovepipe, the cords of wood. "Sarah," he said, "that steel's going to sweat ice the first time the temperature drops below zero. You'll have condensation dripping on your heads all winter. And if that stove gets too hot, you're living inside a metal oven. You won't be able to touch the walls." She thanked him for his concern. He left shaking his head. A week later, Betty Carver, the postmaster's wife and the unofficial voice of Valley Common Sense, mentioned it at the general store. "A woman alone doesn't need to complicate things," she said. "There's a reason people build cabins, not whatever that is." Nobody disagreed with her. By mid-December, Sarah had become the subject of quiet speculation. Poor woman, doing her best. But that setup, it wasn't going to work. The kindest thing people said was that she'd figure it out by January and move into town for the rest of the winter. The less kind thing they said was that she was risking her daughter's lives out of stubbornness. Sarah heard the talk. She didn't respond to it. She just kept splitting wood, keeping the stove fed, checking the stovepipe for creosote, making sure the gap between the Quonset and the barn stayed clear. Because Sarah Kellerman understood something that Ed Pruitt and Carl Hoskins and Betty Carver didn't. She wasn't trying to build the perfect house. She was trying to survive the winter, and she was about to find out if she'd done enough. The talking didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. By Christmas, the Quonset in the barn had become a running joke at the Two Rivers Tavern. The kind of thing people brought up when the conversation lagged. "You hear what Sarah Kellerman's doing out there?" "Yeah, barn inside a barn. Like those Russian dolls." Laughter. Another round of beers. Carl Hoskins told the story at least 3 times. About the tin can. About how she was going to freeze. He didn't say it with malice. Carl wasn't a cruel man, but he said it with certainty. "I give her till mid-January," he said. "Then she'll pack up the girls and head to her sister's place in Helena." Ed Pruitt was less generous. "I tried to warn her," he said, "but she's got that Kellerman stubbornness." Daniel was the same way. Wouldn't listen to sense till it bit him. That comment stung, because Daniel Kellerman had died on a job site where he'd insisted on working alone. Betty Carver didn't repeat gossip. She just made observations. Loud observations. At the post office. At the church potluck. "I don't judge," she said, which was how she always started before judging. But when you've got two little girls depending on you, maybe pride isn't the thing to lean on. The implication was clear. A good mother would have asked for help. A good mother would have taken charity. A good mother wouldn't be experimenting with survival strategies like some kind of mountain hermit. Even people who meant well said things that landed wrong. The pastor, Reverend Holloway, stopped by the property in late December. He brought a ham and a bag of canned goods. "We're praying for you, Sarah," he said. "And if you need a place to stay this winter, there's families in the congregation who'd be happy to take you and the girls in." Sarah thanked him for the ham. She didn't take him up on the offer. After he left, Emma, her oldest, 9 years old, asked a question. "Mama, are we doing something wrong?" Sarah looked at her daughter. Emma's cheeks were pink from the warmth of the stove. The Quonset was holding steady at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, even though it was 18 degrees Fahrenheit outside. "No, baby," Sarah said. "We're doing something different. That scares people sometimes." Emma thought about that. "Mr. Hoskins says we're going to freeze." "Mr. Hoskins has a big house and a full woodshed," Sarah said. "We've got this. And this is enough." She believed it. She had to, because the alternative was admitting that everyone else was right. And if they were right, she'd made a terrible mistake, one that might cost her children more than just comfort. So she kept the stove burning, kept the rhythm steady. Small fires, frequent feeding. The cast iron radiated heat evenly into the curved steel shell, and the shell held it. No condensation, no ice. The interior temperature stayed consistent. But Sarah knew, everyone knew, that the real test hadn't come yet. The cold they'd seen so far, mid-teens, low 20s, that was normal December weather. The old-timers were watching the sky, watching the way the birds were moving south in thick flocks, watching the behavior of the cattle, who were staying closer to shelter than usual. Something was coming, and when it hit, the valley would find out if Sarah Kellerman was stubborn or smart. Stay with me, because the blizzard of 1979 was about to arrive, and it was going to be the kind of cold that didn't forgive mistakes. If you've ever been underestimated, hit that like button right now. You're going to want to see what happens next. January 10th, 1979, 6 p.m. The temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit when the wind shifted. Sarah noticed it first as a change in sound. The barn had its own voice, creaks, groans, the occasional pop of wood expanding and contracting in the cold. But this was different. A low moan, sustained, like the valley itself was inhaling. She stepped outside. The sky to the northwest was the color of old bone. A flat, dense ceiling of cloud moving fast, too fast, toward the ranch. The cattle were already pressed against the southern fence line, backs to the wind. Sarah had seen storms before, but this felt different. By 9 p.m., the temperature had dropped to -4 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, -18 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind hit 40 miles per hour. Sustained. Not gusting, sustained. And then the snow started. Not flakes. Not flurries. A wall of white that erased the world beyond 20 feet. Carl Hoskins, a quarter-mile west, woke up at 2 a.m. because his chimney was howling. The draft had reversed. Smoke was pouring into his living room. He spent the next hour clearing the flue, freezing his hands, cursing the wind. Ed Pruitt's house, newer construction, well-built, was burning wood faster than he'd ever seen. He'd stacked 4 cords in October, thinking it would last till March. By the second day of the storm, he'd gone through half a cord. His wife started rationing. Small fires. Let the house cool to 50 degrees Fahrenheit at night. Bundle under blankets. Betty Carver's husband, Jack, went out to the woodshed on the morning of January 11th and found that 3 days of wet snow had soaked through the tarp covering their woodpile. The split logs were frozen into solid blocks. He spent an hour with them all, trying to break them apart. Brought them inside. They hissed and steamed in the stove, barely producing heat. All over the valley, the same problems compounded. Wet wood, reverse drafts, chimneys clogged with ice, massive houses that were impossible to heat when the temperature hit minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Because that's where it went. January 12th, 4 a.m. The mercury hit minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. With the wind, the effective temperature, the feels-like number, was minus 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Exposed skin could freeze in under 4 minutes. People started burning furniture. Particle board from cheap bookshelves, plywood scraps, anything that would combust. Jack Carver carried his daughters into the kitchen and shut the door to the rest of the house. They slept on the floor in front of the stove, wearing every layer they owned. Carl Hoskins gave up on his fireplace entirely. He moved his family into the bedroom, sealed the door with blankets, and ran a kerosene heater. The fumes gave him a headache, but at least it was warm. Ed Pruitt's youngest son, Michael, developed frostbite on 3 fingers when he went outside to check on the horses. They had to wrap his hand in lukewarm water for 20 minutes to restore circulation. And the storm didn't stop. January 13th, January 14th, January 15th, 6 days of unbroken cold. Temperatures that hadn't been recorded in the region since 1933. 45 years. The valley was suffering. But inside the Quonset hut, inside the barn on the Kellerman property, Sarah Kellerman fed the stove twice a day. Small splits, seasoned pine and Douglas fir from the cords she'd stacked in the gap between the Quonset and the barn walls. The wood was bone dry. It caught instantly, burned clean, almost no smoke. The cast iron stove radiated steady heat into the curved steel shell. The shell warmed the air inside the Quonset. The gap outside, the 8 feet of dead air between the Quonset and the barn, acted as a buffer. The wind screamed against the barn's exterior, but inside the barn the air was still. Cold, yes, maybe 10 degrees Fahrenheit, but still. And inside the Quonset, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Consistent, stable, comfortable. Sarah's daughters slept under 2 wool blankets instead of 5. They played cards on the floor. Emma read to her younger sister by lamplight. No condensation, no ice on the walls, no drafts. The stove's firebox held a coal bed for 12 hours between feedings. Sarah didn't wake up at 3 a.m. to reload. She didn't ration heat. She didn't worry about running out of wood. Because the wood was right there, dry, protected, warming gently in the outer gap. She burned 1/3 of a cord in 6 days. Carl Hoskins burned 4. Now stay with me, because the numbers I'm about to show you, they're the numbers that silenced an entire valley. Don't go anywhere. January 16th, 1979, 10 a.m. The wind finally stopped. The temperature was still minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, but the air was still. After 6 days of relentless howling, the silence felt almost physical. People emerged from their houses like survivors of a siege. Carl Hoskins stepped outside and looked at his woodshed. Empty. For cords of firewood gone. He'd have to buy more from the mill in town, and the roads weren't even plowed yet. Ed Pruitt surveyed the damage to his home. 3 windows had cracked from the thermal stress. The propane bill was going to be catastrophic, and his son's frostbitten fingers were still wrapped in gauze. Betty Carver's kitchen stove had warped from overuse. The cast iron had expanded unevenly, and now the door wouldn't seal properly. Jack was already talking about replacement costs. All over the valley, people were counting losses. Frozen pipes, cracked foundations, livestock that hadn't made it, wood supplies that had run out too soon. And then someone, nobody remembers who, asked the question, how'd Sarah Kellerman do? Because nobody had seen her. Nobody had heard from her. The general assumption was that she'd either left for Helena before the storm hit, or she was in serious trouble. Carl Hoskins volunteered to check. He drove his truck down the snow-packed road, the engine coughing in the cold, and pulled up to the Kellerman property around noon. The barn doors were closed. Smoke rose lazily from the stovepipe, thin, barely visible. He knocked, waited. Sarah opened the door. She was wearing a sweater, not a parka, not layers of wool and fleece. A sweater. Behind her, Inside the barn, he could see the curved metal shell of the Quonset. And through the Quonset's open door, he could see Emma and her sister sitting at the table, drawing pictures. They weren't bundled up. They looked comfortable. Carl stared. "You okay?" he asked. "We're fine," Sarah said. Yeah. We made it. Burned through a lot of wood, though." "How much?" Carl hesitated. 4 cords. Maybe a little more." Sarah nodded. "I used about a third of one." There was a long silence. "A third," Carl repeated. "Give or take." He didn't know what to say. He looked past her, into the Quonset. The interior was warm enough that he could feel the heat radiating from 20 feet away. "How hot is it in there?" he asked. "Inside the Quonset?" "About 68. Maybe 70 degrees Fahrenheit." Carl Hoskins stood there in the snow, in minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit air, looking at a woman in a sweater who just told him she'd kept her home at 68 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 days on 1/3 of a cord of wood. He didn't call her crazy. He didn't say, "I told you so." He said, "Can I see how you did it?" Sarah stepped aside. The word spread faster than the original mockery had. By January 20th, 3 people had come to the Kellerman property to see the Quonset in the barn setup. By the end of the month, it was 11. Ed Pruitt was one of them. He walked the perimeter, measured the gap between the Quonset and the barn walls, checked the stovepipe installation, ran his hand along the corrugated steel, feeling the residual warmth. "No condensation," he said, almost to himself. "None," Sarah confirmed. "And the firewood stays dry. Gets drier. The heat from the stove warms the air gap, pulls moisture out of the wood." Ed nodded slowly. He looked at the small cast-iron stove, the neat stack of split logs, the 2 cots where Sarah's daughters slept. "I'm sorry," he said. Sarah looked at him. "For what?" "For thinking you didn't know what you were doing." She didn't gloat. She didn't rub it in. She just nodded. "You were trying to help," she said. "I appreciate that." But Ed Pruitt went home that day and started sketching. By spring, he'd built a modified version on his own property. Not a Quonset hut, but a small insulated cabin inside his existing barn. Same principle. Double shell design. Air gap for thermal buffering. Carl Hoskins did something similar. He converted half of his equipment shed into a winter living space with a wood stove and a 6-foot air gap between the inner wall and the outer shell. By the winter of 1980, 17 properties within a 50-mile radius had adopted some variation of Sarah Kellerman's design. Not all of them used Quonset huts. Some built timber frame cabins inside barns. Others used pole buildings with interior insulated cores. But the principle was the same. Create a small, heatable core. Surround it with a larger, unheated shell. Use the air gap as insulation and the outer structure as a windbreak. It wasn't a new idea, technically. Inuit people had been using similar principles for centuries. Snow houses with entry tunnels that trapped cold air below the living space. Scandinavian builders used double wall construction in extreme climates. But Sarah Kellerman hadn't read about those techniques in a book. She figured it out because she had to. Because she had $340 in the bank, 2 daughters to keep alive, and a winter that didn't care about her circumstances. And in doing so, she'd proven something that the experts had missed. Let me give you the numbers one more time, because these are the numbers that matter. Fuel consumption. Carl Hoskins, standard cabin, single wall construction, 4+ cords in 6 days. Ed Pruitt. Modern insulated house. Propane backup, 3.5 cords equivalent plus $340 in propane. Sarah Kellerman. Quonset inside barn, 0.3 cords interior temperature during peak cold. Minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Hoskins. 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Ration heat, family in 1 room. Pruitt. 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Propane heater running continuously. Kellerman. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Consistent. No rationing. Fire maintenance. Hoskins. Fed stove every 3 to 4 hours, including overnight. Pruitt. Combination of wood stove and propane. Near constant monitoring. Kellerman. Fed stove twice daily. 12-hour cold bed retention. Firewood condition. Hoskins. Wet wood, frozen logs, poor combustion efficiency. Pruitt. Covered outdoor storage, some moisture issues. Kellerman. Bone dry wood stored in thermal gap, optimal combustion. The Quonset hut itself wasn't magic. The steel shell had a thermal mass that absorbed and radiated heat, but that alone wouldn't have been enough. The barn was the key. The unheated outer shell that blocked wind, created dead air space, and provided a secondary barrier against convective heat loss. Together, they functioned as a thermal battery. The small stove heated the small space. The steel shell stored that heat and released it slowly. The air gap insulated. The barn blocked wind and precipitation. And the result was a system that outperformed modern construction by a factor of 3-to-1 on fuel efficiency. Sarah Kellerman wasn't an engineer. She didn't have a degree in thermodynamics. She didn't run calculations on R values or BTU output. She just understood something simple. Air is the best insulator when you trap it between two shells. Small spaces are easier to heat than large ones, and dry wood burns better than wet. The frontier settlers knew this. The Norwegians knew it. The Sami people knew it. The Inuit knew it. But somewhere along the way, modern American construction forgot it. We built big houses with high ceilings and single-wall construction. We relied on abundant, cheap energy, oil, gas, electricity, to overcome the inefficiency. And when that energy became expensive or unavailable, we suffered. Sarah Kellerman didn't invent the solution. She just remembered it. And in doing so, she saved her daughters' lives. By 1982, the barn-within-a-barn technique had become standard practice in parts of Montana, Wyoming, and northern Idaho. Ranchers and homesteaders with existing outbuildings began converting them into winter living spaces. The Quonset hut variations were popular because surplus military shelters were cheap and available. But people also used shipping containers, pole buildings, and even old travel trailers as the inner core. The principle remained the same: double-shell thermal design with an air gap. Sarah Kellerman never patented the idea. She never wrote a book about it. She never went on a lecture circuit. She just kept living, raised her daughters, ran the ranch. And every winter, when the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, she fed her stove twice a day and stayed warm. In 1995, a graduate student from Montana State University interviewed her for a thesis on vernacular architecture in extreme climates. The student asked, "Did you know it would work?" Sarah thought about that for a moment. "No," she said, "but I knew the alternative didn't." That's the lesson here. The experts told her she was wrong. The community doubted her. The conventional wisdom said it wouldn't work. But Sarah Kellerman understood something deeper than conventional wisdom. She understood necessity. And necessity doesn't care about your doubts. It only cares about whether you survive. The Quonset in the barn wasn't elegant. It wasn't pretty. It didn't look like what people expected a home to look like. But when the coldest blizzard in 45 years hit the northern Rockies, it kept two little girls warm and safe while the rest of the valley burned through their winter with supply in less than a week. That's not luck. That's not accident. That's applied physics, born from desperation, proven by crisis. And it's a lesson that modern off-grid builders are only now rediscovering. The best insulation is often the simplest. Trap air, block wind, keep your heat source small and your fuel dry. The frontier settlers knew it. Sarah Kellerman proved it. And now you know it too. So here's my question for you. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop a comment and let me know. I want to hear your stories. And if you're still here, if you watched this whole thing, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, because every single week, I bring you one real frontier technique that actually saved lives when everything else failed. Not theory, not speculation. Real strategies, tested by real people in conditions that didn't forgive mistakes. Sarah Kellerman's story isn't just history. It's a blueprint. And the next blizzard? It's already on its way. The question is, will you be ready? Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.